Thank you so much for joining us. We have prepared a wonderful panel for you. It's always interesting, anytime I moderate a panel or I participate on a panel, to think about the history of that panel. You know, it starts with one title, one headline. And when you think about Iran, it's been the headline for so many years. But I don't think the conversation could be more important than it is today, especially when you're talking to the right people, the people who know what's going on, the people who care what's going on, and the people who have an idea how things should be or where they would go from here. And this is exactly the panel that we have today. So the panel between the title and what you're about to see is a difference between night and day sometimes, because the panelists change, you know, you change names, you contact people, some can make it, others can't. But I have to tell you, I met with each and every one of the panelists today, and we had some really wonderful conversations. And I'm hoping that we can transfer those wonderful conversations to you today. And the reason why I'm saying this is that we want you to participate in this panel. The panel is just not the people here on stage, but it's all of you. And I would encourage you early on to participate. Don't wait until the last minute. We want your questions from the beginning. And for that purpose, I'm going to ask the technicians to show us where the microphone is in the audience. Microphone? Okay. So let's have the microphone ready. And feel free to ask you questions, even if, oh, there's the microphone. So, okay. All right. So we're getting the people who will be in charge of the microphone. So please, please, please ask your questions early, engage the panelists. You have some really great experts on stage, and they have wonderful things to share with you. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you. First of all, I want to introduce Dr. Hussein Mousavian, who's a former spokesperson for the nuclear Iranian negotiating team, and he's now a Princeton scholar in residence. What Dr. Mousavian brings to the table is decades of negotiations. He was a diplomat for Iran. He knows the Middle East very well. He knows the Arab Middle East very well. He's someone who brings to the table something, as you will see during our discussions, something of a unique perspective. And I would like to start with him in a second. Let me just go through the panel real quick and then come back to you, Dr. Mousavian. We have Dr. Sami Al-Faraj, who is the head of the Kuwait Center for Strategic Studies. We also have with us Lieutenant General Robert Gard, chairman of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Jean-François Giraud, director of the MENA department at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Hasni Abidi, director of the Study and Research Center for the Arab and Mediterranean World in Geneva. Great panelists, but thinking about where we are today, the US just elected a president for a second term, President Barack Obama. Iran is definitely in the news. The nuclear ambition of Iran is something that worries many, not just regionally, but internationally. There was a conference on non-proliferation that was announced, and it gave hope to many, but right now it's postponed, perhaps canceled. The developments of the last few days in Gaza could not be more dangerous and more worrisome to many. How does Iran fit into all this? I want to start with Dr. Mousavian, because I don't think anyone right now can describe where things are better than you. Briefly, Dr. Mousavian.
Definitely, we have a deadlock on Iranian nuclear dilemma, because it's clear to everyone 10 years of negotiations have failed. Fortunately, Europe and America today is convinced the war is not option. Definitely would have catastrophic consequences, striking Iranian nuclear facilities. And there is no legitimate reason to attack Iran because there is a consensus internationally. Even the national intelligence estimate of the US confirms, first, Iran does not have nuclear bomb. Second, there is, the Iranian authorities have no decision to go for nuclear bomb. And 10 years of continuous inspections, more than 4,000 man-day inspection of the IAEA, confirms there is no evidence of diversion in Iranian nuclear dilemma, the Iranian nuclear program. The second issue is the sanctions. Europe and the US and P5+1 in general, they believe on diplomacy plus sanctions pressures. I believe they have been, specifically the US and Europeans, at least during President Ahmadinejad, since 2005, they have been focusing more on pressures, maybe 90% of their capacity has been mobilized, orchestrated for pressures and sanctions to change Iranian behavior on the nuclear policy. For European, I believe this is the case, but about the US, Iranians, they have doubt whether the US is really, after resolving Iranian nuclear program, or using the nuclear file as an instrument to orchestrate international pressures and sanctions to bring regime change. Because from Iranian point of view, the core policy of the US since 1979 revolution has been regime change. And they believe now the US has found something to mobilize international community to reach that goal. But sanctions have failed. And whether this policy also would lead to a solution, I am completely sure sanctions would not make Iran to comply with what the West is asking on the nuclear issue.
I'm gonna move to Dr. Bard and get the U.S. position on this. Of course, Barack Obama gets a second chance at perhaps negotiating or.
Yep.
So President Obama gets a second chance because he tried, but as we heard, nothing worked so far. Do you think this new term is going to bring any change? And do you agree that sanctions have failed so far?
Well, let me say, first of all, the only point I disagree with that has just been said is there really haven't been 10 years of negotiations. The United States position after the attack on the towers, the 9/11 attack, has been to try to dictate solutions. No negotiations, in my view, as such, have taken place. President Bush, then President Bush, as late as 2008, said that we do not negotiate with terrorists and radicals, and clearly by calling Iran a charter member of the Axis of Evil, he was referring to Iran, and he said negotiating with terrorists or radicals is appeasement. So the U.S., just to cite an extreme case, in dealing with North Korea, the U.S. position was, before we would consider any concessions to the North Korean interests, they must comply with complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of their nuclear program. And in the case of Iran, we kept insisting that you must give us the outcome we are seeking, namely that you indefinitely suspend enrichment, before we will enter into any possible discussions on taking notice of what is genuinely in the Iranian interests. Now, President Obama did come in, I think, with a different view. He did hope to engage Iran, but Iran has certain legitimate doubts about the goodwill of the United States, going back with the U.S. complicity in the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected president of Iran in 1953, to support of Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis in the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran, shooting down the passenger aircraft. There's been a long history, despite the Algiers Accord, when we agreed to get our diplomats released that were held in Tehran, that we would not interfere in the internal affairs of Iran. Of course we have. And I do agree that it's understandable that the Iranians would perceive the real U.S. objective not in terms of non-proliferation, but rather in terms of seeking regime change. My hope is that after the bitterness of the election in the United States and the hardline opposition of what we call the Tea Party fringe of the Republican Party, now the president can concentrate on what are in the true interests of the United States, because he doesn't have to cover himself by looking toward re-election again. So I'm holding out that hope. I have had occasion to meet with the president. I do believe in his good faith, and I think he will genuinely seek it. But the fringes of the Congress will object to any perceived concessions as appeasement, and it will be very difficult politically, because a number of the sanctions have been passed into law by the Congress. The president is in a position to be able to suspend them, but not to remove them without action by the Congress. So it's going to be complicated, but I believe that the United States has to demonstrate that the purpose of diplomacy is not to dictate to the other side, but when you have a disagreement, to work together to achieve an outcome that is to the benefit of both sides. And I think that it's so obvious that both sides would tend to benefit by coming to an agreement, concession by concession, step by step, but with a picture of what the outcome might look like, to demonstrate to Iran that it does have an interest in negotiating with the United States to try to achieve such an outcome.
And we will be talking about this a lot more on this panel. I want to go to Mr. Giraud. You've heard the U.S. Position. I mean, the President Barack Obama is in a very difficult position, because even if he wants to negotiate, he's facing opposition. But let's hope that things will move forward, and he will, now that he doesn't have to worry about re-election anymore, he will be able to move forward. How do you see it from the French perspective? It's obviously not as hard for the French, and the French is not even as invested as the Americans in this. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course, and tell me where the French stand on this issue.
Je voudrais rappeler d'abord que c'est une négociation qui ne se passe pas entre l'Iran et les États-Unis. C'est une négociation qui se passe entre les 5 membres permanents du Conseil de sécurité, plus l'Allemagne, les 5 plus 1, et donc un certain nombre de pays dont la diversité exprime l'unanimité de la communauté internationale. Cette unanimité, elle s'exprime sur 2 principes simples. L'Iran a le droit, comme chaque État, de disposer de l'énergie nucléaire civile. Deuxièmement, il y a une légalité internationale qui a été rappelée par le Conseil de sécurité, qui a été rappelée par le Conseil des gouverneurs de l'AIEA, qui s'appelle la non-prolifération. Et dans ce cadre, la position de la France, avec ses partenaires, c'est de croire à la négociation. La négociation n'est pas terminée, c'est une négociation difficile, une négociation que l'on appelle de la double approche, c'est-à-dire négocier et d'un autre côté, renforcer les pressions pour convaincre l'Iran de la détermination de la communauté internationale. Si l'Iran, comme il le dit, ne souhaite pas disposer d'un arsenal nucléaire militaire, pourquoi n'accepte-t-il pas la légalité internationale? L'Iran est parti au traité de non-prolifération, donc la communauté internationale ne demande qu'à voir clairement quelle est la finalité du programme nucléaire iranien.
Thank you very much. And of course, as Mr. Giraud said, the negotiation is not just Iran and the US, it is the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, but it's also the neighbors, it's also the region, and a major player in the region is Israel. And I want to go to Hasni Abidi for his perspective on this triangle that it seems to me and many observers that anytime we get to a point where, as Mr. Giraud was saying, or as Dr. Bard was saying, we get to a point where there is talking, there is give and take, the issue of Israel goes into the conversation, and all of a sudden things change. Tell me a little bit about the triangle, Iran, Israel, US, and could this be the problem? Could this be what's making negotiations, sanctions, diplomacy fail so far?
Israël complique la situation entre l'Iran et les États-Unis et la communauté internationale, même si j'aime pas trop le mot communauté internationale. Je ne pense pas que le groupe 5+1 représente d'ailleurs, ni le Conseil de sécurité, la volonté de la communauté internationale. Mais avant de répondre à ce que j'appelle moi le triangle de la mort entre l'Israël, les États-Unis et l'Iran, 2 séquences importantes. Quelques années, nous étions invités par Ata Allah Mohajarani, qui est un homme réformiste proche de Khatami. Et quand il a quitté le ministère de la Culture, il a présidé un centre de dialogue entre civilisations. Il y avait plusieurs hommes politiques et proches des mollahs. Et un des hommes politiques m'a dit une phrase très intéressante. Il m'a dit, vous savez, nous avons ici une compétition non déclarée entre les mollahs qui sera le premier à serrer la main aux Américains. J'en avais compris qu'il y a une volonté de normalisation. Pour les Iraniens, c'est une norme d'être un pays important et de ne pas avoir cette acceptabilité ou de ne pas négocier en tant qu'un État important de la région par les Américains. Il y a 2 semaines, il y a 3 semaines, vous avez lu la presse américaine, Washington Post ou New York Times avait fait un papier en disant qu'il y a une lettre secrète entre Obama et l'administration et les Iraniens pour dire que Obama, en cas de sa réélection, il n'était pas contre l'idée de négocier directement. Il y a un souci de part et d'autre de normaliser les relations. Les Iraniens ne peuvent plus vivre avec cet oubli, cette ignorance de la part des Américains. Ils veulent absolument que ce régime soit reconnu. Évidemment, ce régime a besoin d'être sécurisé et le programme nucléaire est un des moyens d'être sécurisé par les États-Unis d'Amérique. Les Américains ne veulent pas donner leur dernière carte de négociation, qui est la reconnaissance de ce régime. M. Mossadegh l'a dit d'ailleurs depuis 1979. Et le président Obama est arrivé à une conclusion selon laquelle que ni les sanctions, ni cette dynamique de négociation de 5+1 n'a donné les résultats attendus. Donc il fallait absolument penser à autre chose. Est-ce que finalement, les États-Unis ou la communauté internationale ne peut pas vivre avec les Iraniens? Est-ce qu'on peut vivre avec un Iran nucléarisé? C'est la question là, importante. Là, sur la question sur Israël, bien entendu, ce que nous constatons, ce que vous constatez tous, c'est qu'on voit bien que les Israéliens vont plus loin encore que les Américains dans cette escalade, non seulement une escalade verbale, mais aussi en termes de mobilisation internationale. Si vous lisez par exemple les échanges économiques, les échanges militaires et l'aide américaine donnée aux Américains, par les Américains aux Israéliens, chaque fois que les Israéliens reviennent à la Maison-Blanche pour dire qu'on ne peut pas laisser les Iraniens à ce stade et qu'il faut absolument intervenir, l'aide augmente. Alors on se demande, est-ce qu'il y a une dynamique, ce qu'on appelle encore de négociation, c'est-à-dire une position de négociation de la part d'Israël pour plus de concessions de la part des Américains dans d'autres dossiers, y compris le dossier du Proche-Orient, ou c'est une position de principe? Moi, on a le droit de se douter sur la position d'Israël concernant la relation avec les Iraniens et leur fermeté, en tout cas, à ce que les Américains les aident à obtenir ce feu vert pour faire une attaque contre les installations nucléaires iraniennes. Donc, pour répondre, pour faire court, oui, Israël non seulement utilise, il trouve dans le dossier iranien un fonds de commerce très rentable dans sa relation avec les États-Unis, mais aussi un élément très important pour faire diversion sur d'autres questions qui sont encore pesantes sur les Israéliens, soit le processus de paix qui est en panne sèche ou dans d'autres dossiers. Et un dernier élément aussi, c'est bien entendu, beaucoup de gens nous disent, mais finalement, Israël peut faire quelque chose pour le printemps arabe. Et je crois que ce qui se passe ces jours-ci à Gaza, je crois aussi c'est la position israélienne dans le dossier iranien, je crois que c'est l'ennemi numéro un qui va freiner l'ardeur de ces populations arabes à se doter de cette transition. Et je crois que si l'Iran veut renforcer les mouvements les plus radicaux dans la région, eh bien, Israël a réussi à gagner, non seulement sécuriser le régime iranien, mais aussi encore affaiblir toutes les voies de réforme dans le monde arabe, mais aussi en Iran.
And of course, we've spoken diplomacy. We've talked about sanctions a little bit. We've talked about what seems to be the biggest problem, stumbling block towards finding a resolution. And if we believe in the notion of the carrot and the stick, we didn't talk about the carrot yet, and maybe this is where Sami Al-Faraj can bring in the perhaps the GCC perspective. I mean, the GCC countries, I mean, they are the neighbors of Iran. They've had issues, each country, having their own issue with Iran. But it seems to me that from a distance, the GCC countries have no intention of war or sanctions or anything aggressive. But your project is an interesting one where you're offering the carrot. You're offering a hand of help. You're offering a way to succeed together, sort of. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I'm not in the business of selling vegetables, so I'm not selling carrots. I will present a carrot. Strategic carrot. I think from the perspective of the GCC, we are the first to be actually impacted by anything happening to Iran, peace or war. So in a sense, and to be really open, we don't want Iran to be the hobby of the United States, and we don't want Iran to be, the evil of the United States. We want things to be balanced as they were before the Iranian Revolution. from our perspective, we have a different perspective than the others because we are very small. We are very close to Iran. A flight from Abadan to Kuwait is less than 6 minutes. So imagine an aircraft flying from Shiraz Air Base in the direction of the oil fields of Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. A third element is that the GCC is not constituted of people dressed up like me. No, but dressed up like everybody here in this hall. In the GCC, there are 202 nationalities, including Iranians. So this is really an international dimension, and so all the stakes are there. People talk about Iran, but next to us is nuclear India. It has 6 million laborers in the Gulf. And Iran, if Iran were to challenge, it's not Iran challenging the status quo vis-a-vis the United States and Western power, but also vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis India and Pakistan and Arab states and Turkey and Israel. Fourth dimension is that we have, because of our smallness, we have to take the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario for us is basically we fear today something happening to Iran because of the economic situation. We fear a refugee crisis in Iran, for instance. So we take all the worst case scenarios to their extreme. Therefore, we have to be ready. We look at the situation between us and Iran and say, we cannot actually look at this as one single crisis. We have to define what the situation is. The situation is, since the Iranian Revolution, is an attempt by the Iranian leadership, and I talk only about leadership, to change the status quo. Of course, this is nice for any revolutionary regime, nice and dandy and acceptable and legitimate, and it's happened throughout history. But for us, every single regional state is going to resist that change of the status quo. Not just us, the Gulf Arabs, but Iraq and Yemen and Israel and Turkey and Egypt, every other nation, and Kazakhstan. So the definition of what is happening for us today is an attempt to change the status quo. We do not look at the grand strategic definition of the situation. We look at the modality, one modality. And this modality, which the world is fearful of, that Iran is going to possess nuclear military capability. So it is quite strange for us to look at the situation between us or the situation of Iran in the Gulf from the perspective of modality, not from the grand strategic perspective. Now, in order to stop Iran from changing the balance of power further, after the demise of the regime of Saddam Hussein, the balance of power was shattered even further. So Iran is quite expansive in the region. Iran believes, or the leadership believes, that it has to have a port on the Mediterranean, and that's why Iran is fighting in Syria today. We ought to look at that and try to find a solution from the grand strategic perspective. And although in a crisis, we ought to basically be ready to the use of force and bear every responsibility coming out of that, meaning war, for instance, against Iran by an international coalition. The first to pay a price after Iran is us, all of us in the Gulf. So therefore, one element of this crisis, this specific crisis, is to be ready to use force, for the use of force, and not us using force, but by others using force against Iran. The other element of this crisis management exercise, I call it exercise, it's a continuous thing between us and Iran. We do not have normal relations with Iran. We do not. We only have series of crises. If the Iranians or Iranian persons or companies do not sell certain goods from Iran to companies in Kuwait, you cannot talk about a volume of trade. What binds us together is what is necessary. So what is necessary is basically to agree on fighting oil spills, agree on fighting drugs, agree on fighting organized crime. So it is the basic necessity. How can we get out of the mold of crisis is to be ready to basically provide our adversary, which is Iran, with face-saving formulas. يجب أن نقدم لإيران حلول تحفظ ماء الوجه. فمن جهة يجب أن نكون مستعدين لحقيقة استخدام القوة وما يستتبع ذلك، وفي نفس الوقت يجب أن نكون مستعدين لحفظ ماء وجه إيران، لأنه لا يوجد خصم في أي أزمة يخرج حقيقة وقد فقد ماء وجهه وكبرياءه. إيران دولة عظيمة. Iran is a great nation, and we cannot basically bear the brunt of a responsibility that war basically started from our territories against Iran. نحن اليوم نحمل إصر أن حربا أطلقت ضد العراق بدأت في مجلس التعاون الخليجي، ونحن نعيش مع هذه المسؤولية. إذن لا نريد مسؤولية أخرى تجاه الشعب الإيراني. إذن ما الذي يجب أن نعمله؟ الذي يجب أن نعمله حقيقة، ونحن بدأنا من عام 97. From 1997 we started a project to how to think about our adversaries. This is related not just to Iran but Iran, Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And just imagine the situation of Kuwait. يعني تصوروا موقع الكويت بين ثلاث قوى متصارعة في منطقة الخليج. فهم منطقيا إن تحاربوا نحن دسنا بالأقدام، وإن تصالحوا نحن سوف ننعم بالرخاء أكثر منهم. These are three elephants. We are like the mouse in between them. If they fight, we will be decimated. If they prosper, we will prosper even more. So this idea brought us to what we call today, I mean, I started this idea in 1997. بدأنا هذا المشروع 1997 والآن هو قيد التطبيق. عندما أقول قيد التطبيق هناك 132 مليار وضعت في هذا المشروع. There is 132 billion that's been basically earmarked for this. Half of it has been spent in building, causeways, in building railways, in building transportation, bridges, and as well as, oil terminals, harbors, financial centers. A new city, for us we call it, the way we looked at our problem with our neighbors, أن الطريقة التي نظرنا بها إلى جيراننا هي we have to change. يجب أن نتغير، لأن كويتنا كويت غني جدا وكثير على حاجة سكانه. نحن Kuwait is it's a very small state with big potential. Kuwait has to change to address the interests of its neighbors. And so we started what we call today all the options we put for further cooperation. إن كل المشاريع التي طرحت من أجل تعاون أكبر وبناء حقيقة أسس السلام بيننا وبين إيران والعراق والمملكة العربية السعودية، لأن هذه الأطراف المتنافسة في الخليج، حتى نكون صريحين جدا. فإذا يجب أن نبني وضعنا 8 خيارات. هذه الخيارات الآن جسدت في شيء اسمه مدينة الحرير. We put 8 options for us to cooperate with Iran.
I want to interrupt you because I don't want to go to the project yet. I'd like to at some point show your video that you brought with you of that, and I'd like to save this for the part of the panel when we talk about solutions, because I'd love for the other panelists also to comment on your project, which I find fascinating. I want to remind the audience that please ask questions. Raise your hand. The microphone is right there with the gentleman. Let him know that you have questions. And I will be pointing to people. So let me know also. So I can see a few right now, which I will go to, okay? I got you. Actually, we can start with the lady with her hand raised. Yeah, if you want to give her the mic. Give her the mic, yeah. Thank you. Oh, there is another one? Okay, it's coming from there. Don't ask your question yet. Yeah, not yet. I'm going to ask Mr. Giraud a question. I'd like to set up, really, I want to go back to how we started the panel with the latest news. We can't ignore the fact that major strikes are being waged on Gaza as we speak. They've been going on for 2 days, ferocious strikes by many standards. Egypt already sent away the Israeli ambassador. It's considering recalling its ambassador from Israel. The region is really up in flames right now. Of course, we've heard from the British government saying that Israel has the right to defend itself, and this response, this is a response to missiles that were, launched on Israel from Gaza. So Israel has every right to defend itself. I'm curious to know, this is the British position, I'm curious to know what the French position is on this. And then I want to also ask you, Lieutenant General, what you think the U.S. Position should be on this, because so far it's not clear, but it's pretty obvious what the U.S. Will say on this. But let's talk a little bit about this before we go to your question. Yes, Mr. Giraud.
Je comprends que nous changeons de panel. C'est un panel sur Gaza et non pas un panel sur l'Iran.
Well, the reason why I'm asking you this, and it's very important, is that for many, the Israeli strikes on Gaza are meant to start a war, Israel's war on Iran, which is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been trying to wage for a few years. Actually, as far back as 2010, now we're hearing that he had plans to go for that war against Iran. So the link is pretty obvious, and I don't think we can ignore the strikes on Gaza today as we talk about Iran, because the idea is, will Iran be dragged into war through these Gaza strikes? And this is very, very important. So yes, the two are linked, whether we like it or not. Yes.
Oui, je crois qu'il est trop tôt pour répondre à cette question. Ce qui est important, s'agissant de la situation à Gaza, c'est que nul élément ne vienne créer un engrenage irréversible amenant à davantage de violence. Chacun a à l'esprit ce qui s'est passé en juillet 2006 entre Israël et le Liban. Personne ne veut revivre un épisode comme celui-là où les populations civiles ont payé le prix de cette escalade. Deuxièmement, la position traditionnelle des pays de l'Union européenne, pas simplement de la Grande-Bretagne, c'est que dans la mesure où tout État a le droit de se défendre lorsqu'il est attaqué, Israël a naturellement le droit de se défendre quand il est attaqué. Et la position de l'Union européenne, c'est les Palestiniens ont le droit à un État. Les Palestiniens ont droit à la justice. Et aujourd'hui, justice n'est pas faite au peuple palestinien. Et c'est pour ça que nous appelons à la reprise des négociations. Alors, ce que vous évoquez, une éventuelle connexion entre ce qui est en train de se passer à Gaza et le sujet du panel qui nous occupe, raison de plus pour croire, comme nous le faisons, en la négociation. Tout à l'heure, M. Moussavian a dit que jusqu'à maintenant, les négociations n'avaient rien donné. Je pense que ce n'est pas tout à fait exact. Les négociations ont accru la suspicion des 5+1 sur le fait que le programme nucléaire iranien n'est pas un programme nucléaire civil. Et donc que c'est avec raison que les 5+1 doivent se mobiliser pour aller plus avant dans la négociation et faire toute la clarté. Les dernières résolutions du Conseil des gouverneurs de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie atomique sont là pour en attester.
Thank you very much. Can we hear from Dr. Gard? Briefly.
Briefly, in the United States, the various political factions compete to demonstrate how strongly they support Israel. How people can regard the United States as an honest broker between the Israelis and the Palestinians is a mystery to me. Of course, the assumption is that the U.S. has some influence over Israel, and perhaps we can pressure them. But as you can see, even after President Obama was elected, initially he was unable to discourage Netanyahu from expanding the settlements in the West Bank. I think it's almost reached the stage now where a two-state solution would be nearly impossible. I have been on the West Bank, and it is so carved up with highways reserved for the Israelis and the rest that it's going to be difficult to get a solution. Specifically, what our position is likely to be in the current difficulty is, first, Israel, we will endorse the British position. Yes, Israel has a right to defend itself. And more than that, of course, this was triggered by Israel taking out a very prominent member of Hamas. Well, we're not in a position to fault the Israelis for assassinations from the air, since we are engaged in precisely that tactic against our own enemies. And then we will urge that violence cease and that there be a ceasefire. I think that's the likely outcome.
One quick question to Dr. Mousavian. Knowing the Iranian mind, do you think that Iran could be dragged into violence, into this violence, if this persists?
I don't believe Iran would drag to a war with Israel in any case, but the problem, Bob, with the Western position toward Israel is not for Israel rights to defend itself, but the West believes Israel has a right to do whatever they want, to attack, to invade Lebanon, to kill Palestinians, to send Palestinians out of their lands, to make nuclear bomb. They have a carte blanche from the West, US and Europe, to do whatever they want. 40 years, Israelis, they have declined to follow and to implement United Nations Security Council resolutions. Look, Iran is not complying with United Nations resolutions on the nuclear issue. See the amount of sanctions and pressures penalizing Iran. And Israel has not complied with one single UN Security Council resolution in the last 50 years. And there is no single punishment. This is the problem with the West. And this is the real problem of the crisis in the region. As long as the West does not change its behavior, US and Europe and all Western countries, I don't believe we would be able to see justice, peace, durable peace, and fair solution to the Palestinians, because this is completely one-sided. Everything for Israel, nothing for Muslims.
Mr. Abidi, you have something to add to this, briefly?
Brièvement, il y a un malentendu dans notre perception et la perception générale qu'on fait, bien sûr, pour ce qui se passe aujourd'hui à Gaza, mais aussi dans le dossier iranien. Regardez aujourd'hui, on parle par exemple du Hamas, on parle du djihad islamique et on parle de cette polarisation. Est-ce que la Palestine ou est-ce que la question palestinienne se réduit au Hamas et les problèmes avec l'autorité palestinienne? Non, c'est une question de droit international. C'est-à-dire qu'on a essayé, on a voulu réduire vraiment cette question à un problème des terroristes qui lancent des roquettes contre des colonies ou bien des territoires israéliens. Ce qui est faux d'ailleurs. Donc il y a d'abord un problème, c'est qu'il y a un déni de réalité dans notre compréhension qu'il s'agit d'un problème d'autodétermination, d'un problème de justice, comme vient de le dire d'ailleurs M. Giraud. Ça, c'est un problème. Mais en même temps, la crise iranienne, elle nous renvoie à une autre dimension, à un problème de compréhension, à un malentendu. C'est que tout le monde sait qu'Israël est un pays nucléaire, mais Israël dit non. Et que chaque fois qu'il y avait des tentatives pour se réunir et faire des réunions pour dire que nous voulons faire de cette région de Moyen-Orient une zone dénucléarisée, l'Iran dit « moi je ne suis pas concerné ». Évidemment, il y a un problème de droit. Moi je dis que le Conseil de sécurité, puisqu'on parle de Conseil de sécurité, quelle est sa Bible? Je ne dis pas le Coran parce qu'il n'y a pas un pays musulman au Conseil de sécurité. Quelle est la Bible du Conseil de sécurité? C'est la charte. C'est le droit international. Donc, aux yeux de millions d'Arabes et de millions de musulmans, le droit est bafoué par l'instance qui est chargée de, justement, le promouvoir. Donc, on ne peut pas dire ou on ne peut pas mobiliser une opinion concernant, par exemple, la question iranienne, parce qu'on sait déjà que cette instance-là, ce Conseil, en fait, piétine en quelque sorte le droit lui-même. D'où un peu ce grand malentendu. La question iranienne, allez-y dans des pays arabes, dans des villages, etc., ça ne les concerne pas, ça ne les intéresse pas. Et d'autres même qui montrent, et ça ce qui est très inquiétant, une certaine fierté quand on dit que les Iraniens, ils sont prêts à avoir la bombe nucléaire. Ça m'inquiète, c'est très inquiétant, parce qu'on ne veut pas que cette région-là devienne une région nucléarisée. Et ça nous revient à cette perception du droit, le non-respect du droit et le déni du droit qui fait que, bien sûr, on réduit la souffrance du peuple palestinien à un problème entre terroristes, alors que c'est un problème beaucoup plus général, et à la question nucléaire, à des négociations. J'ai l'avantage d'habiter à Genève, et nous avons reçu un round de négociations 5+1. Je peux vous dire que tout ce qu'ils voulaient les Iraniens, c'est d'avoir William Burns, qui négociait à l'époque pour les Américains. Et pour eux, les Allemands, ou les Français, ou les Britanniques, ce n'est pas, ils savent très bien que la position, elle est plutôt dictée par les Américains. Donc, encore une fois, il s'agit d'une relation, d'un grand malentendu qui doit être réglé entre Américains et entre Iraniens. Merci.
All right, Dr. Faraj, very, very briefly before we start with the questions of the audience.
I think we have to look at the situation in its generality. There has been incidents on the Golan Heights. There has been fires fired in the direction of Israel. And there has been the actions by Hamas. And then there has been also intervention by Iranian helicopters over a Saudi oil field that's been demarcated as Saudi from 1968. يجب الربط بين إطلاق النار من قبل في سوريا باتجاه الجيش الحر باتجاه إسرائيل والأحداث في غزة. أنا أعتقد أن هذين الحدثين لهم علاقة بأسباب محلية في سوريا وفي غزة. بينما لأن الإيرانيين معروفين بقضية السيطرة على الأزمة، يعني حتى الآن تدخلوا في حقل نفطي سعودي وأوقفوا سفينة تنقيب سعودية، ومع ذلك بسبب أن احنا تعودنا على التعامل بضبط نفس مع إيران وكذلك الإيرانيين بضبط نفس معنا، فلا تحدث أزمة مثل ما تحدث في غزة. Because of, I believe that the Iranians are very good at strategic as crisis stability. They have been dealing with us. We understand them. They understand us on the Gulf front. In the other fronts, like in the Syrian front or in the Gaza front, the causes, I think they are there. They are not Iranian, I believe, and therefore the modus operandi in dealing with them by Israel is basically the right of Israel and the right of Hamas to deal with each other. As regards us and Iran, we have also a different modus operandi.
All right, now to the audience. Oops. Yes, please tell us who you are, who you're with. Just 1 second, we can't hear you. We can't hear the...
Ça marche?
Ça marche.
Je me présente, je suis Farah Hashbab, étudiante en 4e année à l'ISCAE, Institut supérieur de commerce et administration des entreprises. Tout d'abord, je vous remercie Madame Octavia Nasr, messieurs, et je veux dire que je suis tout à fait contre l'énergie nucléaire, parce que cela n'apporte que des dégâts à l'humanité, à long et à moyen terme. Mais je me demande parfois pourquoi les grands États imposent des sanctions exorbitantes à l'Iran alors que Israël est en train de développer son programme nucléaire sans aucune intervention, sans aucune contrainte. Pire, certains grands États, tels que les États-Unis ou bien la France, sont en train de développer leur propre programme. Alors que logiquement, on ne peut pas interdire aux autres ce que l'on se permet. USA controls Israel, but who controls the United States of America? Si vous, grands États, je demande une réponse à Monsieur Giroud, aux grands pays. si vous, grands États, France, États-Unis, Allemagne, si vous êtes vraiment intéressés par le sort de l'humanité, si vous portez vraiment le fardeau du développement durable des générations à venir sur vos épaules, mais pourquoi cette schizophrénie? Pourquoi vous interdisez et vous permettez de